From bold engineering to its eventual doom, we're covering it all. We're unraveling the mystery of the Junkers Ju-187, a World War II design so bizarre it feels like it came from a sci-fi movie. If you're into outrageous aviation history, you're in for a treat. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to keep the madness flying. Let's dive in, pun totally intended. To understand why the Ju-187 came into existence, we need to rewind to the 1930s and 1940s, when the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber ruled the skies, or at least it tried to. The Stuka was the terror of Europe during the early years of World War II. Its screaming sirens, ominously nicknamed the Jericho trumpets, were designed to strike fear into enemies on the ground, and fear it did. From the invasion of Poland in 1939 to early Blitzkrieg campaigns, the Stuka was instrumental in Germany's early victories. Its ability to deliver pinpoint bomb strikes made it a precision tool of destruction. But here's the catch: the Stuka was slower than molasses on a cold day, and about as agile as a brick. When the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, the Stuka was untouchable. But when enemy fighters came into play, like during the Battle of Britain, the Stuka's weaknesses were glaring. With a max speed of just 210 miles per hour at sea level, it was easy prey for faster, more nimble aircraft like the British Spitfire. Its fixed landing gear and lack of defensive agility made it a sitting duck, or a sitting Stuka, if you will. The Luftwaffe quickly realized that the Stutka's glory days were numbered. While it continued to serve effectively on the Eastern Front and in North Africa, it was clear that a successor was needed, one that could address its vulnerabilities while retaining its strengths. Enter the Junkers Ju-187, a concept born out of necessity and fueled by the German penchant for audacious engineering. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a complete reimagining of what a dive bomber could be, incorporating revolutionary features like retractable landing gear and, of course, that infamous rotating tail, the vision of the Ju-187. The Ju-187 wasn't just a minor tweak to the Stuka, it was a bold attempt to create a dive bomber that could survive the increasingly hostile skies of World War II. With the Luftwaffe losing its air superiority in many theaters, the designers at Junkers knew they needed to up their game. The mission was clear: build a faster, more heavily armed, and better armored aircraft that could evade enemy fighters and deliver its payload with precision. First on the agenda was addressing the Stutka's most glaring flaw: its fixed landing gear. While the Stutka's exposed wheels gave it a charmingly retro look, they were a major drag, literally. The Ju-187 was designed with retractable landing gear to improve aerodynamics and boost its top speed. This change alone promised to make the new dive bomber far more competitive in combat. Then came the armament. The Ju-187 was envisioned as a flying fortress, with firepower that dwarfed its predecessor. Two forward-facing 20mm cannons provided a devastating punch for strafing runs and aerial combat. For defense, the designers included not one, but two rear-facing guns, a 13mm machine gun and a 15mm cannon, both remotely controlled. This was a significant upgrade from the Stutka's single rear gun, giving the Ju-187 a much better chance of fending off enemy fighters. But the real showstopper was its bomb-carrying capacity. The Ju-187 could haul a whopping 2,200-pound bomb under its fuselage, along with additional bombs under its wings and even on its tail. This payload was more than double what the Stuka could manage, making the Ju-187 a true heavyweight in the dive bombing game. And let's not forget the rotating tail, the piece de resistance of the Ju-187's design. This feature was meant to solve a long-standing problem: the rear gunner's limited field of fire. By rotating the vertical tail fin downward, the Ju-187 would give its rear gunner an unobstructed view of any pursuing enemy aircraft. It was an ambitious idea, to say the least, and one that showcased the lengths to which the Luftwaffe was willing to go for innovation. In theory, the Ju-187 was shaping up to be a game changer, a faster, deadlier, and more versatile dive bomber that could hold its own in the skies. But as we'll see, turning this ambitious vision into reality was easier said than done. The development journey of the Ju-187 was as ambitious as it was tumultuous. tumultuous. Following the Luftwaffe's realization that the venerable Stuka had reached the limits of its effectiveness, the need for a successor became urgent. However, transforming bold ideas into functional machinery presented significant hurdles that would eventually seal the aircraft's fate. The centerpiece of the Ju-187's design, the rotating tail, epitomized both its innovation and its greatest challenge. This revolutionary mechanism was conceived to address the problem of restrictive defensive coverage in traditional dive bombers. By allowing the vertical stabilizer to pivot downward, Junkers engineers sought to grant the rear gunner an unobstructed firing arc, thereby enhancing survivability. However, the complexity of this design proved daunting. Creating a system that could pivot the tail without compromising structural integrity or flight performance required precision engineering. Early prototypes revealed concerns about durability under combat stress and questioned how pilots would control this novel feature in high-pressure scenarios. Aerodynamics compounded the difficulties. Wind tunnel tests uncovered stability issues during tail rotation, with the aircraft's flight characteristics varying unpredictably. These variations not only made the Ju-187 harder to fly, but also raised doubts about its reliability as a combat platform. The balancing act between innovation and practicality became a persistent theme in the aircraft's development, as engineers grappled with solutions that often introduced new problems. Simultaneously, the project faced the relentless pressures of a shifting war landscape. By 1943, Germany's strategic position had deteriorated. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was now overstretched and undersourced. The Reich Air Ministry, mindful of the escalating demands on Germany's war economy, began scrutinizing the Ju-187. Alternative strategies, such as adapting existing aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 for dive bombing roles, appeared more cost-effective and less risky. Resource shortages and shifting priorities eventually overshadowed the Ju-187's promise. The elaborate rotating tail mechanism, while visionary, was deemed impractical for mass production, with faster, more versatile fighters already stepping in to fill the gap. The dedicated dive bomber concept was rendered obsolete. Despite reaching the full-scale mock-up stage, the Ju-187 was cancelled before it could prove itself in the air, leaving behind a legacy of unrealized potential and engineering audacity. Alright, let's dive into the technical specifications of the Junkers Ju-187, and I promise I won't make it as boring as reading a washing machine manual, though the Ju-187 did have a few more buttons to push. So where do we start? Yes, the engine. The Ju-187 was going to be powered by the Junkers UMO 213, a 12-cylinder, 1,776 horsepower beast. This thing was designed to give the plane some serious oomph in the sky. We're talking a top speed of 250 miles per hour. Now, is that fast? Well, for a dive bomber in the early 40s, it was like hitting the gas pedal in a 1940s Volkswagen Bug and thinking you're in a Ferrari. Not mind-blowing, but it got the job done. And hey, at least it's faster than the original Stuka, which could barely outrun a cloudy day. Moving on, let's talk about firepower. This bird was armed to the teeth. Two forward-facing 20mm MG-151 cannons, because obviously, if you're dive bombing, you need to make sure that everything in front of you is also very, very dead. But it doesn't stop there. The Ju-187 also came with rear-facing remote-controlled guns. Fancy, right? It packed a 13mm MG-131 machine gun and a 15mm MG-151 cannon. Yes, you heard that right. Remote-controlled. This is World War II's equivalent of having a PlayStation controller to shoot down enemies, except instead of pixels, you're shooting in actual planes. It's like they were trying to mix Call of Duty with Aviation. And now for the bomb load. If you thought the Ju-87 Stuka was decent at ruining someone's day, the Ju-187 was about to take it to a whole new level. It could carry a 2,200-pound bomb in a semi-recessed bay under the fuselage. That's not just enough to knock out a bridge or a building. It's enough to ruin everyone's weekend plans for miles around. On top of that, there were 4 550-pound bombs under the wings, and just for good measure, more bombs on the tail. Yes, because clearly the designers wanted to ensure that no part of the Ju-187 was left unexplosive. And let's not forget the retractable landing gear, which was quite the upgrade from the Stuka's fixed gear that looked like it was wearing clown shoes. By tucking the wheels away during flight, the Ju-187 was meant to be more aerodynamic. Well, as aerodynamic as a plane with a rotating tail can be. But hey, it's the thought that counts, right? All in all, the Ju-187 was going to be a flying fortress of bombs and bullets, complete with the aerodynamics of a refrigerator. But in theory, It could dive bomb and fight off a few pesky fighters at the same time, kind of like trying to swat flies while riding a bike downhill. So in summary, big engine? Check. Bigger bombs? Double check. Rotating tail and a lot of guns? Oh yeah, it's definitely ready for a crazy action movie. Just too bad it never made it to production. Alright, let's talk about the rotating tail feature. Arguably the most what were they thinking aspect of the Junkers Ju-187. Imagine sitting in a design meeting during World War II, and someone suggests, hey, what if the tail, rotated? Instead of laughing and moving on, everyone in the room was like, yes, brilliant, let's do it. And that's how the rotating tail came to be. So what's the deal with this tail? Normally, the tail fin on a plane helps keep the aircraft stable, like the rudder on a boat. It keeps the plane flying in a straight line, which, is kind of important when you're dive bombing something. But the brilliant minds behind the Ju-187 decided that instead of a boring old tail that just sits there, they'd make it pivot. So the vertical fin could swing down mid-flight. Why? Because the rear gunner, sitting in the back, kept complaining about not being able to see the enemies behind the plane. Apparently the tail was in the way. So naturally, the solution wasn't to adjust the gunner's position or, give him a periscope. It was to move the entire tail out of his line of sight. Here's how it worked, or was supposed to work. In flight, the rear gunner would be like, hey, I can't see anything back here. And someone would hit a button or crank a lever. We don't actually know because they never built a working model. Then the vertical fin would rotate downward like some kind of mechanical tail wag, giving the gunner a clear view of the skies behind. No more pesky tail getting in the way of their perfect aim. Genius, right? Well, in theory. Now, let's think about the logistics of this. First off, what happens to the plane's stability when you move the tail mid-flight? The tail is not just there for decoration. It's kind of essential for, not crashing. Swinging the vertical fin down might sound like a cool idea, but it probably would have made the plane handle like a drunk goose for those few moments. Imagine trying to control a dive bomber with its tail swinging around like a weather vane in a hurricane. You can almost hear the pilots muttering, "This is fine," as they wrestle the controls. Then there's the maintenance nightmare. Moving parts tend to break, especially when they're, say, the entire back end of your plane. The more complicated a system, the more likely it is to fail. And during a war, the last thing you need is your fancy rotating tail getting stuck in the wrong position. Oh, no big deal. The tail is just flapping around back there. Totally normal. Add to that the strain of combat conditions and you've got a recipe for disaster. But perhaps the biggest flaw was that this rotating tail feature was a solution to a problem that didn't really need solving. Sure, the rear gunner's view was blocked, but so what? Plenty of planes had fixed tails and managed to function just fine. It's like inventing a car with a rotating back seat, just so passengers can get a better view of the traffic behind them. Ultimately, the rotating tail never made it past the drawing board, and for good reason. The engineers likely realized that making a plane with a tail that swivels mid-flight was about as practical as adding a disco ball to the cockpit. Cool in theory, but totally unnecessary. Challenges and criticisms. This is where things get interesting, because the Junkers Ju-187 didn't just face challenges, it was basically drowning in them. If the plane were a movie, this section would be the bad reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. Let's dive into why the Ju-187 never made it past the prototype stage and became one of those what could have been planes in the Luftwaffe's lineup. Engineering complexities, aka why does this plane hate mechanics? Let's start with the obvious, the rotating tail. This wasn't some tiny design quirk like adding cup holders to a car. It was a massive engineering headache. Imagine being the mechanic tasked with figuring out how to keep the tail from falling off mid-flight. That rotating tail mechanism wasn't just complex. It was like giving the plane a Rubik's Cube for a tail. With all the moving parts, wires, and structural stresses involved, it's no wonder engineers started to see the flaws early on. Maintaining that tail in the field, under wartime conditions, was probably the kind of job that would send mechanics running for the nearest exit or whiskey. And we haven't even talked about the added weight and drag. Planes thrive on simplicity, and the Ju-187 decided to do the opposite. The rotating tail made the design heavier and more complicated, which not only made the plane harder to maintain, but also added unnecessary points of failure. You can picture the crew, wrench in hand, saying, "Sure, let's make this even more difficult. Pilot training." So wait, the tail does what? Now imagine you're a pilot getting briefed on how to fly this thing. You've flown the Stuka before, so you think you got dive bombers down to a science. Then someone drops this bombshell. Oh, by the way, this plane's tail rotates mid-flight. What? Flying planes is hard enough without worrying that your tail might decide to take a joyride halfway through the mission. Training pilots to handle the sudden shift in aerodynamics every time the tail moved? That's a nightmare. There's a reason planes don't have moving tails. It messes with the stability and control. Flight stability, wobble wobble, crash crash. The rotating tail wasn't just a mechanical problem, it also messed with the plane's flight dynamics. When you're flying, stability is key. You don't want any surprises when you're maneuvering a 250 mph dive bomber. But with the Ju-187, that rotating tail meant that mid-flight, the aerodynamics could shift unexpectedly. One minute, the plane might handle like a typical dive bomber, and the next, it could feel like you're riding a roller coaster, except you're the one controlling it, and crashing is not optional. Why didn't it make it past the prototype stage? Because common sense prevailed. By 1943, the Luftwaffe probably realized they had bigger problems than trying to teach pilots how to handle a plane with a built-in tailspin feature. The war was turning, resources were scarce, and engineers had already put in a lot of work refining existing aircraft. The upgraded Ju-87 Stukas were performing decently, and on top of that, the Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s had stepped into dive bombing roles pretty successfully. In short, the Ju-187 was just too complicated for its own good. It tried to solve problems that weren't really problems, at least not ones that couldn't be fixed with simpler, proven designs. And when it came time to decide whether to move forward with it, common sense, for once, won out. Better to stick with what you know works than to gamble on a tail that might send you spiraling into the ground. The Ju-187 project met its end in 1943, never making it past the prototype stage. By that time, it became clear that the plane's complex rotating tail and other innovations weren't worth the trouble. The Luftwaffe had other, more reliable options, and improvements to the existing aircraft, like the Ju-87 Stuka, made the Ju-187 seem unnecessary. Additionally, fighters like the Bf-109 and FW-190 had been adapted for dive bombing roles, performing just as well, if not better, without all the engineering headaches. The rotating tail, while an ambitious idea, added complications in terms of manufacturing, maintenance, and pilot training. The unexpected performance gains simply weren't enough to justify continuing development. With resources and time becoming increasingly scarce, the Luftwaffe chose to cut its losses. The Ju-187, once envisioned as a cutting-edge successor to the Stuka, was officially canceled, leaving behind only a wind tunnel model and a full-scale mock-up as testaments to what might have been. What if the Ju-187 had made it into production? While its rotating tail and increased firepower might have been revolutionary, it's unlikely the plane would have dramatically changed the course of the war. The Luftwaffe already had effective dive bombers and fighter bombers like the FW-190, so the Ju-187's performance gains would have been marginal at best. Its complicated design would have likely led to mechanical issues, delaying production and causing maintenance headaches in the field. In combat, the Ju-187 may have performed well against ground targets, but its limited speed and agility still would have made it vulnerable to faster Allied fighters. The rotating tail, while innovative, likely wouldn't have provided enough of a defensive advantage to save it from enemy fire. Ultimately, even if it had been deployed, the Ju-187's impact on the war would have been minor, a curious footnote in aviation history rather than a game changer. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the bizarre world of the Ju-187, be sure to like the video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button for more weird and wonderful aircraft history. Don't forget to share with your fellow aviation enthusiasts. See you next time.